Okay, this is Don Brash, the ex-leader of the National Party when they were in opposition. He was the Governor of the Reserve Bank. He's also a pioneer in New Zealand. He's also a reformer. He's also a defender of the New Zealand Constitution. He's also an expert on Treaty of Waitangi, and he is trying to do a great job. And I'm encouraged by Don Brash, and he's also a great guy. So thank you so much for coming tonight, Don, and we look forward to what you've got to say.
Thank you very much, Geordie, and thank you very much for organising this occasion.
No worries.
Earlier this month, something shocking happened at Waitangi. And no, it wasn't that I was unable to deliver a speech. That may or may not have been rude, but it wasn't shocking. Indeed, it should have been expected. No, I'm referring to the total inability of the Prime Minister to answer two very simple questions about the Treaty of Waitangi. She was asked first, what is the first article of the treaty? And she had to admit she didn't know. She was asked what the second article of the treaty is, and she didn't know that either. A few days ago, I asked a journalist to tell me what the first two articles of the treaty are, and she didn't know either. She thought it was about partnership. I asked her, I wasn't asking her to recite the text of the first two articles, though since they're quite short, that wouldn't be an unreasonable expectation, but she just simply did not know what the articles of the treaty provided. I was simply asking her, as the Prime Minister had been asked, to tell me in substance what those clauses provided. And I suspect that ignorance is widespread, despite the fact that all political parties in Parliament confess strong support for the treaty. And fundamental to those so-called principles of the treaty, which is what they profess support for, is the principle of partnership. Several points to make. First, the word partnership does not appear anywhere in the treaty. Or does any other word, which might be a synonym for the word partnership, appear in any version of the treaty? That's true whether we're talking about the English draft, from which the Maori version of the treaty was translated, or the Maori official version, or the so-called English official version. The word simply does not appear at all. Second, the word partnership implies two or more distinct parties to a relationship. But almost 180 years after the treaty was signed, there are no longer two distinct parties in New Zealand. We've intermarried, we've formed relationships that cross racial barriers. We're no longer two separate people. Nobody in New Zealand today has exclusively Maori ancestors. Most of those who have a Maori ancestor have more ancestors who are not Maori. We've allowed people who have one Maori great-grandparent and 7 non-Maori great-grandparents to speak as if they are part of an oppressed minority, suffering still from what their non-Maori great-grandparents did to their one Maori great-grandparent. Third, one of the most insidious implications of talk about partnership is the claim that in 1840 the Maori chiefs who signed the treaty did not really cede sovereignty to the Crown at all. In an astonishing report issued in 2014, the Waitangi Tribunal claimed that the Maori chiefs who signed the treaty agreed to share power and authority with Britain, but did not cede sovereignty. In other words, they did not cede authority to make and enforce law over their people and territories. But as historian and treaty specialist Professor Paul Moon of AUT made it clear at the time, the tribunal's conclusion was manifestly wrong. Chris Finlayson, at that time Attorney General and Minister of Treaty Relations, and sometimes well known for being someone well known for having considerable sympathy for Maori aspirations, said in reaction to the tribunal's report that there was, quote, no question that the Crown has sovereignty in New Zealand, unquote. The wording of Article 1 of the treaty is in fact quite unambiguous. It makes it totally clear that the signatories ceded, quote, to the Queen of England forever the entire sovereignty of their country, unquote. And it is abundantly clear from the speeches made by many chiefs at that time that they understood they were being asked to surrender to a higher authority. Several objected strongly and said they would not accept that they would have less authority than Governor Hobson. But nevertheless eventually did sign, presumably because of the benefits they could see of a higher authority putting an end to intertribal warfare and fending off any French involvement. One of the chiefs who signed, Tamati Wakanini, was described on his tombstone as a chief of Ngāpuhi, the first to welcome the Queen's sovereignty. 20 years after the treaty was signed, in 1840, now 1860, at a conference of many scores of chiefs in Kohimaramara, speech after speech spoke of the benefit of having the Queen as the highest authority in the land. Saraparananata, writing about the treaty in 1922, said that, quote, the treaty made one law for the Maori and Pākehā. If you think things are wrong and bad, then blame our ancestors who gave away their rights in the days when they were very powerful. Moreover, with very rare exceptions, the overwhelming majority of New Zealanders with a Maori ancestor have behaved as if sovereignty was ceded in 1840. They've served in the police and the armed forces. They've bought and sold assets, registering those transactions with an agency of the Crown. They paid income taxes and GST. They've been employed by the Crown as nurses, teachers and bureaucrats. They've accepted unemployment benefits, New Zealand Super and other benefits. They've accepted treatment in public hospitals and from highly subsidised doctors. They've been educated in public schools and universities. They've travelled overseas on New Zealand passports, and they've accepted large sums of money from the Crown in resolution of historical grievances. Very strange behaviour if Maori haven't accepted the sovereignty of the Crown. And yet we continue to get what I can only describe as willfully misleading stuff printed in our media. Just a week or so back, the Sunday Star Times carried an article about the treaty by Hinimoa Elder. She correctly quoted the first article of the treaty as providing for Maori chiefs to cede to the Queen, quote, absolutely and without reservation, all the rights and powers of sovereignty, unquote. But then notes astonishingly that Article 1, quote, speaks to sharing power. Of course, it does no such thing. Politicians as different as David Lange and Winston Peters have long rubbished the idea that the treaty created a partnership between the Crown and Maori. Interviewed on Australian television in 1990 when he was Attorney General, Mr. Lange asked, did Queen Victoria for a moment think of forming a partnership with a number of signatures, a number of thumbprints, and 500 people? Queen Victoria was not that sort of person. In a major speech a decade later, in November 2000, he elaborated on this point, and because of the huge importance of the issue, and because we now have a Labour New Zealand First Coalition government, of course, it's worth quoting from this speech at some length. This is a quote from David Lange in November 2000. Democratic government can accommodate Maori political aspiration in many ways. It can allocate resources in ways which reflect the particular interests of Maori people. It can delegate authority and allow the exercise of degrees of Maori autonomy. What it cannot do is acknowledge the existence of a separate sovereignty. As soon as it does that, it isn't a democracy. We can have a democratic form of government, or we can have Indigenous sovereignty. They can't coexist, and we can't have them both. I'm still quoting, "Here I come to the dangers posed by the increasing entrenchment of the treaty and statute. The treaty itself contains no principles which can usefully guide government or courts. The treaty is a wonderful stick for activists to beat the rest of us with. It's been the basis of a self-perpetuating industry in academic and legal circles. Many on the left of politics who sympathise with Maori aspirations have identified with the cause of the treaty, either not knowing or not caring that its implications are profoundly undemocratic." And that's the end of the quote from David Lange. Winston Peters, now Deputy Prime Minister, and of course Maori himself, of course, speaking in Paihia a couple of years ago, described the idea that Queen Victoria would have entered into partnership with some 500 chiefs, many of whom were illiterate and none of whom she had met, as absurd. Retired District Court Judge and Canterbury University Law lecturer Tony Willey noted a few years ago that, quote, "Maori and the Crown are not partners in any sense of the word. It is constitutionally impossible for the Crown to enter into partnership with any of its subjects. The true position is that the Crown is sovereign, but owes duties of justice and good faith to the Maori descendants of those who signed the treaty, and of course to all other New Zealanders." But wait, Maori radicals will say, you've forgotten about Article 2. On the contrary, Article 2, quote, under that article, "The Queen confirms and guarantees to the chiefs and tribes and to all the people of New Zealand the possession of their lands, dwellings, and all their property," unquote. The treaty made it clear that the Queen was not proposing to dispossess the chiefs of their property rights, and made it clear that if and when they wished to sell their property, they should do it through her agent, a way of protecting Maori from unscrupulous settlers. So there cannot be the slightest doubt as to what the treaty had actually said, particularly given that the third article guaranteed to all New Zealanders, quote, "in return for the cession of sovereignty, the rights and privileges of British subjects." In other words, the same rights. Despite that, successive governments have behaved as if the Crown is in some kind of partnership with those who have a Maori ancestor. Indeed, the so-called principles of the treaty, a concept dating back no more than 3 or 4 decades and originating originally with the fourth Labour government, routinely talk of partnership. Subsequent governments have adopted the same approach. When the National Party was in opposition between 1999 and 2008, it talked boldly about a single standard of citizenship and promised to scrap separate Maori electorates. Bill English made that commitment, and so did John Key and I. But in government, the national government not only made not the slightest attempt to scrap separate Maori electorates, they foisted co-governance on many local governments, including the independent Maori Statutory Board in Auckland, passed the Marine and Coastal Area Act, enabling Maori tribes to lodge claims for customary marine title over the entire coast, and promised generous taxpayer funding to enable those legal costs, those claims to be met, continued favourable tax treatment for the businesses arising out of treaty settlements, amended the Resource Management Act to give a major role for Maori in local government decision-making, allowed the Education Council to foist a radical interpretation of our history on our school system, signed the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and appeared to agree that Maori have rights and interests in water akin to ownership, despite the long-standing common law position that nobody owns water. And now we have a government which has even established a separate ministerial portfolio of Crown Maori relations. The website of that department states that, quote, "the Crown and Maori will act reasonably, honourably and in good faith towards each other as treaty partners," unquote. Other material issued by the Minister, Kelvin Davis, speaks of the need for, quote, "true partnership." The consultation which the Minister had with Maori New Zealanders last year recorded many complaints that the Crown often acted, quote, "without Maori approval," as if Maori New Zealanders had a special right to be consulted about the rights enjoyed by other New Zealanders, above the rights enjoyed by other New Zealanders, and indeed had a right to veto government decisions. The 14 members of the Hobson's Pledge Council wrote to Kelvin Davis, the Minister, in May last year to express our grave concern at these developments. We copied the letter to the leaders of all the other political parties in Parliament. We received not a single reply. And this, I guess, is why the Prime Minister's ignorance, quite extraordinary ignorance, of what the treaty provides is so serious. She's been swept along by the nonsense the chiefs did not cede sovereignty, but instead entered into some kind of partnership with the Crown. There's a serious danger that it's this nonsense that may be taught in our schools under the guise of teaching New Zealand history, New Zealand children, our, quote, true history. True history? Bollocks. It's long past time for the majority of New Zealanders, Maori and non-Maori, to say enough. Thank you very much.
Don, stay standing there because we're going to have a time of question and answer. So, you ready for all that?
Yep.
Just when you have a question, just speak it out nice and loudly so that we can all hear the question, because that's almost as important as the answer. All right, thanks, perfect.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Don, my name is John DeVere. What about from the British point of view? Do British historians, can they actually send a team out here or whatever to discuss this? What they gather, what was the treaty about? And I mean, we're putting all out. I mean, like, could the Privy Council or someone adjudicate on actually the historical document that their royalty was involved with?
I'm not aware of them doing that, frankly. They may have done, but I'm not aware of
Wouldn't
it.
it make sense for the British historians to actually tell us, well, actually, this is what we signed?
Well, we know what they signed. The wording is unambiguous. The English draft from which the Maori was translated is clear. We have that.
Yeah.
We know what the Maori says. That's the official version of the treaty.
Yes.
We know what the so-called official English version says, and it's all very unambiguous. There's not any much ambiguity about it.
Well, but the English version is different from the 4th of February version. The version which our laws are based on is different, I understand, from the actual 4th of February was the final draft, which was found under a pile of tea towels in a drawer.
In Pukikawi. That's right. The so-called official version does refer, for example, to forests and fisheries, which is not in the Maori version and not in the draft version from which the Maori version was translated. But those differences are relatively minor.
Well, I think that's quite important, actually.
Well, okay, but we can agree that all versions say that Article 2 guarantees Maori their property. That's unambiguous. Yeah.
Are you good? Just following up on that, actually. So I was interested in the international law aspect of, and why you haven't talked about the Te Tiriti or Waitangi, because that clearly talks about Article 1 ceding Koanatanga to the British Crown, Article 2 ceding Tino Rangatiratanga, or not ceding, acknowledging Tino Rangatiratanga. And I'm just interested in, when you say that that's nonsense, my understanding is that that's international law, that the Indigenous language document is upheld.
That's right.
But what you're talking about is the English language one. Can you just explain to me why you focus on that one and not acknowledging that there is quite a lot of
well, we know what
the
the official version is, you correctly point out, the Maori version. That's the official version of the treaty. Everyone accepts that. We know what that said at the time because we have the draft, English draft from which it was translated. And it was clear from the speeches at the time that chiefs were being asked to be subordinate to the Queen. I mean, they resented it. They said, no way we subordinate to Governor Hobson.
There is an alternative view out there that says that Māori would never have ceded Tino Rangatiratanga. They would never have ceded chieftainship. That they would have agreed to the Crown being in charge of its own people, definitely, no doubt about that. But there is also quite a strong voice out there that says that Māori, in those verbal conversations, would never have said, you're in charge of me, because their iwi structure wouldn't have allowed that. So I'm just interested in why, like, it just seems like you're saying that you're presenting a balanced view, but from my perspective, it looks like you're looking at it through an English worldview, which is completely acceptable. That's an okay thing to do when we're having a conversation about it. But I seem to be missing your acknowledgement of a Māori worldview looking at this.
I guess what I'm saying is the Maori chiefs who said, we don't want to sign this thing because it involves giving over authority, nevertheless did sign it.
Because they talked about tēnā rangatiratanga.
They recognised that the treaty they were signing meant being subordinate to Governor Hobson.
No, they thought.
I think that's my point, is that there's a different view of that than yours. You have one view, which is you have every right to have your view, but I think there's another view that it would be really useful to bring into the conversation.
Can I answer your question? In 1831, 17 chiefs wrote a letter to William IV, and Tamaki Wakanani and Patuoni were two of those signatories. They were pleading with the British to come and take over New Zealand. Why were they so anxious? They were afraid of the French. Hongi Hika had just walloped most of the North Island, and some Germans had rearmed some of the tribes down in the Bay of Plenty. They were going to come back and wallop Ngāpuhi big time. And so they really, really were keen. And the British were not actually interested in New Zealand until about 1838. They reluctantly took over this country. So there's a huge motive for them to sign.
They also negotiated the independence, the Declaration of Independence in 1835. So that says that England was interested.
That was superseded by 1840.
Okay. 1835 was somewhere
I just think, I guess my point is that there's a balance of views. It's not being
Can I just say something?
Well,
Didn't have a written language. We were oral people. My tūpuna, my ancestors were oral people. We had a spoken language. The only written may have been in carvings, in the way we carve to express ourselves. We did not write the written Treaty of Waitangi. Treaty of Waitangi, there's a difference. Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, we were oral people. I am here to say that we were oral people and we did not see tino rangatiratanga.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you. What I'd like to do is, I appreciate you saying what you said, and you as well. Everybody's got a right to have a discussion here, but what I've got to try and do, this is Don Brash's night, and I want to be able to keep it orderly so that we can hear your opinion, and once and let her finish talking, and anybody else finish talking, and then we have a response from anybody else, so that we don't have people shouting over each other, because that's what I don't want. Don, do you want to respond to that?
No, I think the point that's being made is that there is clearly a big difference of opinion about what Maori thought they were doing at the time. And what I'm saying is, to me, the speeches which they gave at the time suggested they understood, as this gentleman here said, that they were being asked to be subordinate to Hobson, and initially they said no way. But nevertheless, after thinking about it, decided to sign. Now, I don't know why they did that, but they did sign a document which had been explained to them meant being subordinate to Governor Hobson, let alone the Queen. So,
and reaffirmed in 1860.
Well, that's right.
But they didn't sign the English version, they signed the Māori version.
That's right.
Which talks about Te Rangatiratanga.
She didn't say that.
Okay, have one person talking at a time.
That's just a question.
Don.
You're right, they signed the Maori version, almost all of them, not some signed the so-called official English version, but that was by accident. The official version was signed in Maori, no question. But as this gentleman here pointed out, 1860, most of the chiefs at Kohimaramara said, thank heavens the Queen is sovereign. And for 180 years almost, Maori had behaved as if the Queen is sovereign. I mean, we've carried New Zealand passports, you've accepted healthcare and
I think it's called colonisation, actually. I don't think it's ceding sovereignty. I think it's called colonisation. You need to name it for what it actually is.
Okay, all right. But you've accepted it, that's what I'm saying.
You don't accept colonisation, it's imposed on you.
Okay,
Can I say something? I think if we all regard ourselves as New Zealanders and consider this a nation of sovereignty, then I think every other thing then we can come together and discuss. And I think I appreciate Mr. Don's historical background. But I think for any New Zealander, if we want to move and create this nation, we cannot just simply all the time go to the history. Of course, understanding is important, but at the same time, I think we should find what are the needs for New Zealanders. You know, only then we move forward together, other than just go into the history, talk about all these things, technical things. I don't think this is good for the nation. And I would like to ask Mr. Don, what, in your opinion, is the nationhood of New Zealand? You know, now, some of the people told me that New Zealand is only a bicultural thing. The Maori would like to settle a score with the Pakeha. And what about so many immigrant groups? The number could be more than the Maori, for example. And if we just say that because of Waitangi Treaty and then we are bogged down by the technical one, and I think New Zealand will have very difficult to move forward as a nation.
Yeah. Well, I certainly agree with that. I don't regard New Zealand as a meaningfully bicultural country. We're a multicultural country. We have people from a whole variety of different backgrounds. And as I said in my comments, there's no one here who doesn't have at least one ancestor who's come to New Zealand in the last 200 years, including Maori. We've all got ancestors who've come here recently. So we're all, as you point out, an immigrant people. Some of us have further roots than others, but we've all got immigrant roots relatively recently. In that respect, even Maori are quite unlike, for example, the Aborigines in Australia, who've been in Australia for 50,000 years. I mean, that's a genuinely...
Don't compare us with the Aboriginals.
No, let him finish.
It's another kaupapa.
Let him finish.
But what I'm saying is
Just obey the rules, otherwise
all the New Zealanders have come to New Zealand within the last 1,000 years. I think that's fairly safe. And most of us have ancestors who've come within the last 200 years as well. I suspect you have at least some ancestors who've come within the last 200 years. Is that right?
We're bicultural, first and foremost, then multicultural. Bicultural is a bicultural agreement.
Bicultural what?
Bicultural, first and foremost, in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
I think that one of the great things about New Zealand is we have a whole variety of cultures feeding into the New Zealand culture. And I think that's...
We're definitely multi-ethnic.
That's right, and that's fantastic, I think.
But our systems aren't that. Our systems aren't even bicultural. Our systems are monocultural.
Well, what I've said in my comments, there's a huge range of things which successive governments have done which give a preference to those with a Maori ancestor, totally inappropriate and totally inconsistent with the treaty. That's the point I was trying to make.
I agree with you.
Okay, and somebody else got, you ladies, thank you for your input, and that's cool. We've got a lot of other people want to ask a question here. Yes, we want to ask a question.
Well, I'm just following on from your comment over there. Do you know of any country in the world where there's peace and prosperity and economic health, where there are different rules for different people based on their race or ancestry?
Well, no, I don't. I don't. And in fact, on the contrary, a lot of the countries which have deep ethnic divisions have all kinds of difficulties. And I guess places like Malaysia, India are good examples where ethnic tensions are very real. And somehow those don't lead to prosperity or harmony.
Okay, another question? Yes.
There's a very well-known Marxist principle in politics, which is to create division amongst people who otherwise are getting along just fine. And it's an historical tactic we've seen being used time and again to divide people who are getting along fine. Have you, Dr. Brash, have you got any insights in possibly how this principle of so-called Marxist politics is being imposed upon our history and our people since only there's just a few decades, to use this treaty as a point of division, whereas before the Marxist narrative was foisted on us, we were getting along just fine. Have you observed that as an historical political principle that's operating behind the scenes?
I'm reluctant to attribute Marxist conspiracy theories to...
Oh yeah, but the philosophy and ideology of it came in quite obviously with this whole movement in the 70s. There was Black Power in America. We could go around the world and see how these things rose up, and in New Zealand was an interesting parallel that that popped up in the 70s around the universities with the Māori Haki and all these other reactionary groups that were seeking to use these issues to divide us and override and rewrite our history. And I think we're seeing that happening in spades now.
Well, you're certainly right that we're seeing history rewritten. No question about that at all.
Yes.
The not conceding sovereignty is a good example of it. I mean, when the Waitangi Tribunal brought that out, historians like Paul Moon, who's a very good historian, whom I think you know, Julian, who specialises in studying the treaty, said, look, that is patently nonsense. Chris Finlayson, who's not known as a sort of anti-Maori minister, again said, look, that is clearly wrong. There's only one sovereignty, and that's the Queen.
So you quite rightly said that the Treaty of Waitangi is not a constitutional document, and yet it is being currently rewritten to serve exactly that purpose. But in our history we do have a constitutional document, and that's the Queen Victoria Charter, the Royal Charter. So why is it that this government will not recognise the Charter, and why is it that it's not even on display in our National Museum?
I can't answer the last question. I don't know why it's not on display in the National Museum, but you're right. The Royal Charter was what formally made New Zealand a separate entity from New South Wales. That's correct. And I don't mind acknowledging that at all. Having said that, I think the treaty is an astonishing document for its time, an amazing document. Nothing like it happened in Australia or Canada or the US or anywhere else. And I did my academic study, or part of it, in Australia in the 1960s. Australian Aborigines were not counted in the Australian census in the 1960s. I mean, we were regarded as absolutely extraordinary and totally and grossly inappropriate. I mean, since 1840, Article 3 says all New Zealanders have the rights and privileges of British subjects. I mean, for 1840, it was a breathtakingly enlightened statement. So I acknowledge completely your point about the Royal Charters, but I don't want to ignore the treaty because itself it was a pretty amazing document.
Yeah, I mean it shouldn't be ignored, but by the same token, it is actually rewriting all of our our legislation at the moment, and that needs to be put into its right context in the history of the country. It is the charters that actually set up our system of laws and governance in this country, not the treaty.
Yeah, I don't think the laws are really being rewritten on the basis of the treaty. The concept of partnership is rewriting our laws, and that ain't in the treaty. There's nothing about partnership in the treaty at all. The word, or even the sentences which might suggest it, it's not there. Now, the Prime Minister clearly talks about partnership and the principles of the treaty as if it were there, but it isn't. It isn't. It's not the treaty which is distorting us, it's a grossly improper reinterpretation of the treaty.
Okay, somebody else with another question. Yes, sir.
There were tribes. I'm no expert.
Big voice, please, because we can all hear. Sorry.
There were tribes, many tribes, that didn't sign the treaty. The Tuhoe immediately comes to mind.
That's right.
They have a whole region in New Zealand, the Uruweras. What will your view be on them having an independent state in the middle of New Zealand?
Well, I think that would be a hugely retrograde move.
Yes, maybe, but have they got the legal right to do that? They never signed the treaty.
No, you're quite right about that. They didn't. I don't know enough about constitutional law to know whether their acceptance of being part of the New Zealand state for 180 years constitutes effective acknowledgement that they're part of the New Zealand state.
Isn't it very like the right of states in the United States, like California, to secede from the Union if they wish?
I think that may be true, yeah. I certainly regard that as an absolutely appalling possibility.
Yeah, again, it might be
for them as much as for us. I mean, Tuhoe individuals, I suspect, are substantial net recipients of state benefit.
Yeah, in America, the federal government is supreme, so they can't actually do that the way it's set up.
You certainly tried from the Civil War, I believe.
Yeah, I just saw what happened. That's why the war was won, and the federal laws were.
Just a thought.
talking about
Yeah,
citizens.
yeah. Okay, so you don't, yeah, very good. Are you happy with that answer?
The answer was I don't know.
That's correct. Yeah.
Let me start. Is there anything over and above the Treaty of Waitangi?
Over and above.
Any constitution or charter that is above the Waitangi Treaty for New Zealand?
Well, we have a constitution. Most people think we haven't got one. We have a constitution, but it's not a written constitution. Like the UK and I think also Israel, we don't have a written constitution. But clearly we have a constitution, and we function with it the whole time.
How is it laid out? It's not written.
Sorry?
What constitution? How is it laid out? It's not written.
Well, it's in a series of different laws. It's not a single document as the US Constitution is, for example. But I mean, we have laws which say we have a parliamentary election at least every 3 years, and we have only one chamber of parliament. Those things are written in law, but they're not in a single document which you could call a constitution.
Yeah, but in the UN, the U.S. Constitution, that supersedes any law in America.
That's
It's
right.
virtually impossible to change
Yeah.
unless all 2/3 of the states and 2/3 of the congressmen. I mean, it's impossible to change. So it is vastly different.
Oh, in that sense, you're right, absolutely. And I'm grateful we don't have that kind of hang-up in the US, because as you point out, trying to change the Constitution is a nightmare.
Yeah, but some things in the Constitution, freedom of speech and other things that are critically important, therefore will always be there and not change.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a fairly good record of freedom.
10
Sorry?
amendments.
That's the last comment.
Sorry, there were 10 amendments.
Yeah, that's right. I think most of the things covered in the US Constitution and the amendments are either law in New Zealand or very strongly accepted.
We've got Human Rights Act and things like that that covers those kinds of things, doesn't it?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that's what I'm making.
Yeah.
Not the right to own firearms.
I mean, we have, as you point out, a law which says speech is protected, free speech is protected, subject to certain conditions,
Yeah.
and I think most people are pretty comfortable with it. Doesn't give vice chancellors the right to ban people making harmless speeches. Yeah.
You haven't asked the question, go.
The argument about oral language and written language, which was raised before, by 1840, when the treaty was signed, there have been hundreds of Maori educated by missionaries in the written English language, and there have been many, many people, particularly men, visiting the UK and Sydney on British ships and so forth that brought back the written language. So to say that they didn't understand the written language is poppycock.
Do you want to respond to that?
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
Wasn't
Hang on, it's not your turn.
Colonisation wasn't named. Different to what you shared. Name it for what happened. Colonisation,
Today,
It
still
happens.
colonizing.
it happened.
Hang on, let it
There's
finish.
a bicultural relationship.
I know.
Kia ora,
Do you-
he
do you
kama
still
from a
consider
Māori
yourself being
worldview
colonised?
perspective.
Hang on, let it finish.
Okay? Te tiriti o Waitangi from a bicultural perspective. It was the government, the Crown at that time, who wrote the Treaty of Waitangi. Māori had te tiriti o Waitangi, oral, verbal. Totally two different interpretations and versions.
Okay. Do you want to-
Colonisation was real. Yeah.
Marin
At the end of the day, Māori did not cede sovereignty.
Rubbish.
Okay, look, okay, wait a minute.
That now.
So we might have to agree to
Okay.
disagree, because Don says that they definitely did. You said they definitely didn't. So we might have to
No, they didn't.
agree to disagree on that point.
Just to help clarify terms, because we need to understand categories and not confuse categories. For example, a bicycle is a wheeled vehicle, but it is not a car. And accordingly, a tribe or a small clan is a group, but it's not a village, it's not a city, it's not a region, and it's not a nation. We are talking here about a sovereign empire of Britain in a historical moment visited upon small villages of people in a remote place. There was no equivalence, there was no matching at all. The gap between the two is so significant, and the symbol of it would be representing a British ship of the line of 74 cannons on a massive vessel which could sail around the world against a dugout canoe. The two are not of the same category. They may both be boats. A chief may be a chief, but he's not a sovereign entity because he has no nation, he has no region, he has no city, he has no town, he barely has a village, and he has a little wooden stick or a stone implement against a cannon, which is just a supreme development of thousands of years of history and technology and so on. To put the two in an equivalent is to misuse categories and to use the language in a wrong way. I can have a candle and it's hot, but it's not the sun. Both will burn my finger, but one's a candle and one is the sun. And in the debate in New Zealand, people have been very confused with their language and their ideas because they are equivocating Queen Victoria, who is the crown, with somebody who's signing away and they represent, let's say, 200 or 300 people if they're lucky in their local group. They are not in any way, state or form in the same at the same level, and yet we're talking as if they are, and that's an illusion.
Because
that is a language problem,
they
and it is a logical problem, it is a procedural problem, it's a legal problem, and it's an historical problem, and right now it's being used as a propaganda tool to confuse people.
Yeah,
we can't discuss the two in the same context.
I'm not quite sure what the point is.
The point is that a chief is not a queen, a head of an empire. They're not at the same level.
Yes, he is.
It's a huge
The point
difference.
is, under international law, you cannot enter a treaty. It has to be two sovereign nations to enter a treaty under international law. And that's what the 1835 Declaration of Independence did, was it created this land as an independent sovereign state that could enter into a treaty with another independent sovereign state. So that's the flaw in the plan. If we had a treaty, it was because it was two independent sovereign states.
That's what
the United Nations say.
That's an interpretation of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, a relatively small number of tribal chiefs signed that treaty. So it's a declaration.
But is it correct that a treaty has to be between two sovereign states?
I don't think it is, but
pretty confident in it.
even supposing it is, that you're saying is we didn't have a treaty because there was no sovereign nation of New Zealand signing with the Queen.
That's what the Declaration of Independence
A
is.
very small number of chiefs
But this is
signed
the
that.
thing with history, right? You can argue it from two different
Am I not
points.
right?
Let Don finish,
Number
please.
of chiefs who signed the Declaration in 1835 was very small. Certainly didn't represent the whole country of New Zealand, that's
No,
for certain. No.
It was northern.
And it was initiated not by the Maori chiefs themselves, but by Busby, who thought it was a good idea. But, I mean, it was a very small fraction of the Maori population represented by
Because
that
the
group.
French were sniffing around and Busby got that thing in 1835.
He didn't want the French. Busby didn't want the French in here.
Correct. So,
But I mean, we're going back into people's brains, right? All we've got is the documents and international law, what United Nations tells us. Like, it's not like I'm making this up. I'm using international law and the reports that have been done on this country, all of that stuff. It's not a weird.
Yeah. I guess my argument was the treaty itself was a very simple document. The chiefs who signed it knew what they were doing, and they effectively handed over sovereignty to Hobson, the Queen via Hobson.
Yeah, I completely get that. That's your opinion. I just have a different one.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you for that.
Julia,
Yes.
Dr. Brash, so you've taken issue with how the Prime Minister's interpretation is of the Treaty of Waitangi. Just recently, you just mentioned that Article 3 said that it offered all New Zealanders the same rights and privileges as British subjects. And so what you're quoting is a irrelevant document called a piece of paper that's back translation called the Littlewood Paper. In the genuine Treaty of Waitangi, it says all Māori people of New Zealand will receive, all Māori people will receive the same rights and privileges as British subjects. And in Te Tiriti it says he tangata Māori. And so it doesn't say all New Zealand. So your interpretation is saying that all people of the 21st century who are British New Zealanders would receive the same rights as British subjects. That's a misinterpretation to me.
But the British settlers in New Zealand at that time already enjoyed the rights and privileges of being British subject. They didn't need the treaty to give them those rights. They already had those rights. What was being conveyed on Māori for signing the treaty was the same rights as British citizens had.
Yeah, so it escalates Māori civil rights up to being the same as British citizens and subjects, yeah?
That's right, absolutely. Right. Fantastic.
But that's not all New Zealanders. So the way you're interpreting Article 3 is that anyone who gets off a plane from Iraq, and the moment they step into Auckland Airport, they have the same civil rights as British subjects.
When they become New Zealanders, they have the same rights. Initially,
through citizenship.
Yeah.
Through permanent residency.
When they become New Zealand citizens, they have the same rights. I think that's what
yeah.
But you're talking about in a 21st century context when it doesn't say that. It specifically was for the natives of New Zealand to get the same civil rights as British subjects.
That's right. And what I'm saying is, at that point, British subjects who were already British subjects already had those rights.
Yeah.
Didn't need the treaty to confer it on them. They had them. So the rights of British subjects was extended beyond those who were already British subjects to the Maori chiefs and their people who signed.
So therefore you'd be better off to say that it gave the same British subjects, it gave Māori, and only Māori, because that's a misinterpretation when you say New Zealanders.
Well, it's a pretty fine distinction. In 1840, there were only British subjects and Maori. And the treaty said, you Maori have the same rights as the British subjects.
Thank you.
No, that was good. Thank you.
Surely there were Chinese.
No, you didn't have the same rights.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
right.
but the issue at the time, I think,
Don.
the issue at the time, I think, was with the Maori, and they were trying to sort the Maori issue out. So even though it's Chinese here, the treaty is principally about
Were there any 1840? I don't think there were.
Chinese.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, Otago, Terror the binding.
I thought that was 1850s.
1860.
It must have been. Yeah, it must have been because I read there was sweet and sour for sale in Russell at that time.
Yeah.
So Don, as to the likes of the iwis and tribes that didn't sign the treaty, I think they've given away their rights to claim that they don't have to come under New Zealand law when they, in themselves, claim money from and through the treaty process, even though they never signed it.
I think that's right. They've de facto agreed to be bound by it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody got a question that nobody knew hasn't asked a question so far? No. Somebody's sitting here with a question and they haven't been given the opportunity. Yes, sir.
Yeah, can I change the subject? CGT. CGT. Not yet. Just we'll keep on saying. Okay. He was saying talk about capital gains tax. There's always one in the crowd.
Maybe tax working group would be interesting because that actually is relevant. Can I just say, the tax working group consideration is actually relevant because in their findings they do actually differentiate between a Maori economy and a non-Maori economy.
The proposed capital gains tax for Maori property is 17.5.
Correct.
And for everyone else 33. So that is a fair point.
Excuse me, can I just make a slight point? That's iwi property, not Maori. Iwi property.
Iwi property.
Yeah, not Maori.
that's quite right. It's communally owned Maori land, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, so not individuals.
No,
that's correct.
No.
That's correct.
There's two levels to it though. There is property that's either iwi or corporation owned and associates thereof, and the second part is about private individual and they're also at 17.5 instead of 28%.
There's a preference actually for Maori corporations now in income tax. Those are taxed at 17.5. The logic to do with dividend imputation, it's a long story, but they take 17.5, but other corporates that take 28.
I will confine myself to a question. In this treaty thing, I read it with very simple eyes sometimes, and I see the Crown, and then I see this the chiefs and the tribes, and then I see a thing called the people of New Zealand. So it looks to me like we've got three groups here: the Crown, the chiefs and tribes, and the people of New Zealand, being all the other people who aren't in under the chiefs and the tribes and their tribal sovereignty system. Would that be a simple way to look at it?
The Crown represents all New Zealanders.
Yes, everybody here.
Yeah. Maori and non-Maori.
Yeah.
Everyone is represented by the Crown.
Yeah.
The current dogma, which I think is totally wrong, implies the Crown is over here, and that's basically everyone except Maori, and Maori are partners of the Crown.
Yeah.
Now that's totally unfounded in the treaty.
So I'm trying to get I just try and get this question straight, because I'm obviously not expressing it right. If there's the Crown over here and Maori over here, where are the rest of us who were around there in 1840? There was a whole lot of people who were here who were accepting the authority of the Crown and therefore didn't need to be signed into it, but by proxy were already participants in the Crown's legal sovereign authority. And so they were equally sharing that with the Maori. I mean, I see the three groups. The Crown is not a group, but it's an entity. And then there's the people of New Zealand, and then there's the tribes. There seem to be, they should all be part of the same conversation. And yet we're only talking as if there's the Crown and the Maori, but in fact, I'm just asking you, does that ever come up in the conversation?
No, my
so
assumption
we
is
are non-entities, all the rest of us are
non-entities. If you're a British subject,
yeah,
you by definition acknowledge the Crown as your sovereign.
Yeah, you don't have to sign a treaty because you're already in the tent.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
So what about those who are here at the time who weren't British subjects?
No answer to that.
We're represented.
Okay, what were you going to say?
Well, my question was looking forward into the future, because we can look back in history and always find evidence to back up our particular worldview. But looking forward into the future is how are we going to work together? How do you see that we can do that when your opinion of my worldview is that it's dogma, and why is yours not dogma? Like, what is it, how are we going to shift that thinking that separates us in your language, as opposed to coming together and going, okay, let me understand what you're thinking and what are your values, this is what I'm thinking. How can we get to that place of working together for everybody, whatever you want to call it, when you consider my worldview to be dogma?
I don't know the answer to that question, quite honestly. At the moment, the two views to me are absolutely irreconcilable. Totally irreconcilable. And that worries the heck out of me. What the solution is, I do not know. I mean, either Maori see the sovereignty and are part of New Zealand, or they're somehow not part of New Zealand, didn't see sovereignty at all, and are some sort of extraneous, what's the word I want? External party to the Crown.
The right word.
External. And to me, Maori are absolutely part of New Zealand.
So what's your vision? Like, why are you doing this? Why are you going out talking and educating people? What's your vision? Because
I want a country where every citizen, irrespective of their ethnicity, has equal political rights.
Okay, but that was a very good question. That was a really good question.
It's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in peace in this land. Like, how do we bring these ideas together? Like, I've got, clearly, a very different view of the world from you. And that's okay. We can't expect to all have the same view, but what we can expect is to find leaders who can bring us together. And it would be really cool if you could step into that role in a way you could find that role. Like, you're saying you don't know how to do it, but you are leading people. You are coming here, sharing your view. You are getting people on board with what you think. And you're saying that you're telling them that what I think is dogma. You are being a leader. My challenge to you is, how can you lead for good to actually bring us together? Because we know that Māori are suffering in this country.
Yep.
And we've got different ideas about why that is. But we know that that's the reality. And we know that they were here first. How can we find that way so that that's not actually happening? How can you take responsibility as a white man with privilege, with voice?
Hang on.
I'm very clear on that, thank you. Like, it's like you've got that privilege, you've got that stand, what can you do?
Yeah, I think that is a very profound question, and I'd be grateful for your advice on it, quite frankly. I'm not joking at that point. It's it's a very serious question, and I don't know what the answer is. All I think at the moment is we are creating more and more divisions for those who chance to have a Maori ancestor. And I think that's appalling. I look at the Maori electorate question, for example. The Maori electorates were set up for a very good reason. Only men who own property individually got to vote. Whereas in the Maori electorates, every Maori man got a vote. It wasn't equal franchise, clearly. They only had 4 electorates out of 76 or whatever it was at the time. But they got a universal suffrage effectively for Maori men. Now, when all men and then all women got a vote, the logic for them disappeared. Now, in 1986, the Royal Commission said they're a very poor way of ensuring Maori representation in Parliament. They're huge geographically. It makes it very hard for the Maori MP in a Maori electorate to effectively represent their constituents. They said if New Zealand adopts MMP, they should go. We've had MMP now for 23 years. We have 30 MPs of Maori ancestry in Parliament, including the leaders or co-leaders or deputy leaders, every party in Parliament. The idea of separate Maori electorates to me is a nonsense. And to me they're causing more division than anything else.
But I'd like to talk about current New Zealand right now. And current New Zealand, where we are right now, as it refers to the beaches in New Zealand and title of all beaches in New Zealand, because I'm under the impression you wrote a great book that talked about the possibility that Maori would claim all the beaches and the title of New Zealand. Isn't that in the process right now?
It's not a question of possibility. All the coastline has been claimed. Now, the claims haven't been heard yet, but 2 of the claims, in fact, are for the entire coastline, but there are hundreds of other claims, about 600 in total, for parts of the coastline. And the national government agreed to provide funding to support the legal costs of those claims, between 112,000 and 400,000, depending on the size of the claim.
Did Finlayson agree to some things where it didn't have to go to the High Court?
There are 2 ways through it, either the court or direct negotiation with the minister.
And so it's in the High Court now? All these claims?
I think so far 2 of 600 have been settled. We're going to be having this argument for decades, not years.
Was that with Finlayson, who was able to agree to that?
Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Sorry?
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
One has been settled. The other one, the tribe did not agree with what Finlayson was offering, and that one's before the court now. So they've gone to court because they want to.
That's the Hawke's Bay one, Susan? That's the Hawke's Bay one?
Yeah.
Okay. So only the Muttonbird one.
Yes.
Muttonbird.
Is the only one that's gone.
Island. Yeah. Okay. Only 1 of 600 settled.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a long way to go.
What is your prediction in the future? Will title be granted to Maori for all the beaches in New Zealand?
In theory, the Marine and Coastal Area Act says you can only get a title, a customary marine title, if you can prove continuous and exclusive use of the coastline since 1840.
Well, wasn't there a case where a stagecoach was used as a road?
Absolutely.
That should have.
That's the Hawke's Bay one that was talked about there.
Yeah. So that should not be granted.
Well, it's impossible to believe that you have 2 claims for the whole coastline. I mean, one of them can't be valid. On the face of it.
Yeah, because I would think all New Zealanders would own the coast and the beaches.
Well, that in fact is what the Labour government, the Alan Clark government, did with the law, Foreshore and Seabed Act. National overturned that and replaced it with the Marine and Coastal Area Act, which is not a bright idea.
Oh, Dr. Brash, I can answer that. You know, in Article 2, you said in the Treaty of Waitangi, it said undisturbed estates, forests and fisheries.
Yeah.
That includes the foreshore. So the word undisturbed means that it doesn't get transferred over into public possession. It doesn't magically become everyone who decides to immigrate to Aotearoa, New Zealand. It specifically belongs to the chiefs and tribes of New Zealand.
Well, forestry and fisheries is not, of course, mentioned in the Maori version of the treaty at all.
Yeah, but it's estates. That's clearly in the Treaty of Waitangi.
Which is?
Estates. Undisturbed estates. I could show you the Treaty of Waitangi if you want one time.
No, I know the treaty. Yeah.
Hang on.
Well, I mean, as I say, I think we're going to be having this debate for a very long time to come. Because I think most New Zealanders will not want a situation where particular tribes are able to exclude other people from the beach. I think this will be a very contentious issue.
Yeah.
Go on.
A few years ago, I'd spent a few years working in Northfield, Sorry. And the one thing that struck me when I was working with individuals as well as marae was that there was no one Māori, there was no one Māori worldview, there was no one Māori opinion on anything. The variances within the groups of Māori and individuals that I met and dealt with was as varied as if for anybody else in this room. So whenever I read, and especially in educational documents these days, that there must be taught the Māori worldview, I've asked what it is, but I have never seen it written down or never seen or have it verbalised. So I don't know if anyone else can tell me what it means, but I don't know.
Well, it's actually quite sad. Can I respond to that? Because when I grew up going to school, the only thing I was taught about New Zealand history was Governor Gray. I knew nothing about what had happened with my tūpuna when I was growing up through the schooling system at that time. It was all about Governor Gray and the history and colonisation and so on and so on. I heard nothing from a Māori worldview perspective.
Okay,
So for me, telling, pardon?
So your family?
Was mainstream
No, your
school.
family, did you talk about?
Oh, my family did, but I'm saying in terms of the system that I grew up in terms of that history, it was only one-sided. I learned one-sided, and that was it.
At school?
So, you know?
So how does that answer my question?
Well, there's a difference in terms of like how you sort of shared in people's thinking, how you shared about how what people's thinking may have been at that time.
Oh,
You
just
spoke
thanks
about
to this.
marketing and whatnot and everything else. Well, you know, if you don't have access to information, if you have only one-sided access to information, and then you don't have access to the other side of the history of New Zealand, then it's very hard to make an informed decision around things.
Thank you.
Yes, what were you going to say?
Sorry, I don't know, my education must have been different because at high school, and I went to a private school, we were taught all about the land wars and holy
I didn't go to a private school.
No, I know.
I was a public school.
But I got
that.
and it's interesting that the private school system would teach us more about the Maori history of New Zealand than the state school system.
No, it didn't.
So I'm sorry, but I feel privileged that I did receive at least a token worldview of what happened. They did try to be balanced and fair, and that's going back 40 years ago.
But history doesn't necessarily create a worldview, and especially not one worldview. There are a lot of inputs into somebody's opinion about it.
And history's always written by the winners. I mean, you can't read books to find out.
I was taught that there were great injustices done. There was absolutely no question that there were injustices done.
Both sides.
And a lot of New Zealanders would feel that, and we feel really sad that there's so much anger. It doesn't matter what we do, we can't seem to get past the anger of the Maori people. Like, how can I undo something that happened, like, you know, over 100 years ago?
Again.
How much do I have to carry the guilt? Like,
Is this all Maori people around?
absolutely not. Some of my
they
really
are.
good friends are Maori. And like, I have a
Look
lot
how
of
beautiful they
respect for the Maori culture. And I would love some of our, you know, in our identity as New Zealanders, I would love, as part of New Zealanders, to incorporate the wonderful aspects of Maori culture. Because especially about tangis, you have amazing things to teach us about death and how to cope with death and grieving and being together and yeah. So please, you know, it's not all bad.
So for me, Dr. Don Brash, you're on a platform there as a leader. So for me, you know, provide both sides of the discussion in terms of what actually happened and why you're doing what you're doing, but provide both sides, because you've got to capture the audience wherever you go. So it goes back to what my friend here said around, you know,
I think
in a
Dr. Brash
leadership
would
role.
say that he's presented what he sees as the truth, not necessarily both sides, but he's saying what is the facts, what is the truth of the situation. He says that the tribe ceded sovereignty to the Queen, and you've said no, that's not true. So those.
Well, it's one truth. It's one truth of me.
Well, no, he would say, would that be fair enough? Would you like to? Is that accurate?
I think that's
I'm
right.
pretty sure the truth is dogma.
Sorry?
I'm pretty sure when you say the truth, that's what dogma's about. When you recognise that there's different truths.
Well, I mean, clearly we all sort of wrestle over documents and treaties and theories and what have you, and you eventually reach a view of what is your conclusion.
Yes, yeah.
That's right.
That's right.
And by definition, you've concluded that other views are wrong. That's how you get to a view. Right? I mean, I'm not saying it is right, but that's the process of reaching a conclusion. You work through theories and arguments and documents and what have you, reach a view. And that's what we all do.
That's based on your values and your
Of course, you can't help that. That's the nature of the case.
Okay, we probably might. Do you want to ask a question?
No.
You said a stretch. I think the one thing that we agreed on, Dr. Brash, here was that one law for all New Zealanders was something we all be able to clap to, and you said yes to. Is that true?
No.
No. Okay, I thought you did. I thought I saw you applauding.
I have a belief that that Māori have two lots of rights. That they have tangata whenua rights, and that they also have rights as British subjects. And I, as a English settler, have British rights. So I don't see under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is the document I choose to identify along with international law, that Māori are tangata whenua. It is not a partnership of equal people. It is a relationship of people that are in a land. And I get that that's not the view of everybody else, but so
And I think
when you ask the question,
what worries me is that I can't see how they can be reconciled with my view. It doesn't seem to be halfway.
there's a way. I reckon we can do it. I really do reckon we can do it.
Okay. Well, I'm up for the discussion.
Living in a history with all Maori having European ancestors, so there's a complete coming together already in New Zealand from the very beginning, where there was no racism, where Maori and Europeans were equal and saw one another as equal. And that's why you had all this intermarriage. That's why it just seems so odd to have a problem today.
We did love and play together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Don, do you want to? Should we wrap it up at this point?
Sorry about racism, mate.
I want to thank you, Julie, for organising the occasion. It was very, very good.
I am really interested in what you've got to say. That's why, and I think I'm interested in what you've got to say as well, and what you had to say, brother. And I pointed to both of you.
Use.
So can we just summarise the basic, the two massive differences in the views here? Don says that the Crown, the Maori ceded sovereignty to the Crown. unequivocally, that's the truth, that's the facts, that's what happened. That's what Don would say. You say that's not what happened. Yeah? Just yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay. And the second thing is, the implication of that is one law for all New Zealanders, irrespective of their ethnicity.
Yeah.
And we would say yes to that.
Yeah.
You'd say no to that?
I would say address institutional racism, and that would work.
Okay,
Can't
yes,
just
yes or no? Yes or no?
Not today.
Okay, not today. All right. Don?
It's a good summary. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming tonight, Don especially, and for giving up your time, because you put yourself in the firing line. And you know what? That's heavy going. Donald Trump's the same, but you're and you put yourself in the firing line, and you keep on coming out. And I just so admire your guts and your courage, and we're with you.